Bishop Barron, what message is Pope Francis sending by canonizing figures like Romero and Paul VI?
Well, keep in mind, whenever a pope, canonizes, he's sending the message about holiness. So to be a saint is to be a person of heroic virtue, and the church always wants to bring holy people forward. So that's the general sense. I think with these two, though, with Romero, a great martyr, someone who gave his life in service of the poor, is something close to Pope Francis' heart. And then Pope Paul is the great pope in many ways of evangelization. He writes this letter called Evangelii Nunciandi, which is very close to the heart of Pope Francis. And it's about the church, by its very nature, is missionary. It goes out. So think of Pope Francis as he becomes pope, says that's the whole purpose of the church, is to go out from itself, not to turn inward. So I think those two messages, this great reverence for the poor and a church that goes out from itself, those are things he sees in these two great saints.
But are there any critics or people in the church opposed to the Pope's decision to canonize Romero in particular?
Oh, probably some who might see him as too associated with, the politics of Central America or with a left-wing, political point of view. And that's been true over the past couple decades. I think the Pope sees him as a pastor. I mean, he was someone who identified with the poor, and he gave his life in service of them, and he spoke out on their behalf. So I don't think he sees it in political terms. He sees it in pastoral terms.
Just making sure. Oh, you don't see my head. Okay.
Nope,
So
no,
okay,
sir,
okay,
no.
fantastic. Because sometimes I move like that. Okay. Romero's been set up for sainthood for a while, but it's been delayed under previous popes. Why?
Well, people speculate. In the case of John Paul II, was there some concern that there was a hyper association with left-wing politics? I'm not sure if that's really the case. Benedict XVI, of course, who's very close to John Paul II, is the one who really green-lighted the beatification of Romero. So he was not opposed to it by any means. And I think he's just very close to the heart of Pope Francis as a Latin American, and he's had a great devotion to Romero. So that's true of all the popes. They have special affection for this person or that, given their background. So I think that's really why it's happening now.
So why are Romero and Paul? You keep saying John Paul and Paul VI considered controversial or unexpected choices for canonization?
I'm not sure I would say that Romero is an unexpected choice. He's been talked about for a long time. As I say, maybe some would see him as associated too much with left-wing politics, but I think anyone that studies his life honestly and seriously sees him as a great witness and a great pastor and a martyr. So in my mind, he really should not be a controversial choice. To me, he's a very natural choice. Paul VI, something I find fascinating about him is how he transcends the left-right split. So on the one hand, he's a great advocate for the church's social teaching. His great letter, Populorum Progressio, is a very, if you want, progressive take on social issues. On the other hand, he writes Humanae Vitae, which is the great statement against contraception, a document which has been extraordinarily prophetic. You read it now, 50 years later, and you say, boy, this thing really saw what was coming. So to my mind, Paul VI transcends the usual splits. Now maybe people on either side of that divide might see him as controversial. I see him as embodying the depth and breadth of the Catholic teaching.
That's great. Pope Francis hailed Paul VI as an outward-looking. Well, what's the significance of this praise when Francis himself faces opposition for modernizing the church too much?
Well, it's, again, Evangelii Nunciandi. So the church by its very nature is missionary. That's what Paul VI saw. And by the way, he took the name of St. Paul, who was the first great missionary, the one who brought the message out to the wider world, finally here to Rome, and then through Rome to the rest of the world. And so Paul VI, Montini, saw that as the great mission of the church. A young Jesuit now, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, back in the 60s and 70s, reads that letter. And he said that's the decisive letter that interprets Vatican II. So now he brings it as Pope Francis to the heart of his ministry, the church that goes out. Very often he said when the church turns inward, it's like oil that goes bad, it goes rancid. That rather the church has to spread its message. So to me that's a very natural connection that he would want to bring that part of Paul VI's teaching forward.
Interesting. On Saturday, Pope Francis defrocked 2 Chilean priests for abuse of minors. And on Sunday, he canonized 2 controversial figures in Catholicism, whether you can say they are controversial or not. What kind of stance and messages do these 2 actions amount to, do you think?
Well, the Chilean thing, I think the Pope is saying very clearly he wants us to be transparent on this sex abuse matter, and he wants accountability to be in place at all levels of the church. These are pretty strong actions he's taking. To defrock bishops, that's a pretty strong statement. And I think he wants to signal clearly to the whole world that A, he's taking it very seriously, and he wants accountability at all levels. So the fact that bishops are being disciplined, that's something I think really new. And many felt that back in 2002 in the United States, when there was a great focus on the misbehavior of priests and disciplining priests, there wasn't a sufficient interest in the misbehavior of bishops and their discipline. I think now the Pope is saying that's what we have to do, and you see it very clearly in that case.
Well, talking about that, do you think that when Pope Francis defrocked the two Chilean priests, he was increasing his favor with critics who say he hasn't done enough with the handling of sex abuse?
Well, I think he's signaling clearly that's what he wants to do. Is he responding to the critics? I think he's responding to the need of the moment, you know, that the church has to have accountability at all levels, from top to bottom. And it's a very vivid way of instantiating that idea.
Talking about Romero, the Pope was wearing his blood-stained
Cincture.
belt. What was he trying? What message was he trying to send with that?
I found that very powerful. So the Pope at the canonization mass wore the cincture, which is the belt around the alb, and that Romero was wearing when he was shot. The fact that Romero was killed while celebrating mass is for Catholics a very powerful thing, because the mass is the representation of the suffering and death of Jesus. And so the priest is acting in the very person of Christ. And so for a priest to die at the altar that way is extremely powerful, participating in the most vivid way in the martyrdom of Christ. And so the Pope wearing that cincture today with the blood of the martyr on it was extremely powerful. I found it very moving.
It's great.
Good man. All right.